Hello, and welcome to the lecture for Module 1, Intro to Family Violence. This is our first lecture, as you know. Generally, I recommend that you watch the lecture first each week. One of my goals in the lecture is to kind of give you a preview of everything we're going to cover in the module, and especially as that relates to the textbook reading. The textbook reading can be a bit difficult sometimes. Sometimes it's going to take you a little bit longer to get through the reading, and you should be taking notes on the reading. And I hope that what I cover in the lecture can give you a preview as to what you're reading, so when you get to a particularly different passage or it gets bogged down a little bit, you say, oh, right, I remember this is what she was talking about in the lecture. So let's get started. Family violence and violence among human beings is nothing new, right? We know that. You may hear your parents or your grandparents or other people you know say, oh, things are so much more violent than they used to be. Things were never this violent when I was a kid. And I would respectfully disagree. We know that the world's oldest tools, the oldest tools in the entire world were discovered in Kenya in 2015. These tools are over 1 million years old from the Stone Age, when our ancient ancestors carved animal bones and rocks into crude tools. And of course, we know they used these tools to kill animals to eat, right? Primarily, that was their food source, was killing animals and eating them so they could survive. But I think it's also fair to assume that they used these implements to hurt each other. Just last year, a large grave was discovered in Poland, and you can see from the photograph of the actual site that there was bones in a mass grave. These bones are estimated to be over 5,000 years old, and when they were subjected to genetic testing, the results were that these people are all from the same family. So this family was killed intentionally. They didn't die because of a hurricane or a tornado or another type of natural disaster like a fire. We know they didn't die from poisoning. Maybe they ate the wrong plants or meat they shouldn't have eaten and that killed them. We know they died by intentional violence because they all died of blunt force trauma to the head. Each one of these skeleton skulls had major non-accidental trauma inflicted upon it. So even 5,000 years ago, we know human beings were very violent towards each other and maybe even amongst these own family members. In ancient Egypt, punishment was very harsh for children. Punishment was very harsh for slaves and for servants. Children could be physically beaten or even murdered by their parents. Household servants could be whipped or beaten for even the slightest infraction, wrongdoing. And the paintings from ancient Egypt depict this violence. That's why we know about it, right? They painted their life stories. And in those paintings, we can see acts of violence committed by one human being against another. This is a big castle in England from the Middle Ages, where we know mutilation and torture was routine. It was common punishment for even the slightest infraction. If you were caught stealing something, even food that you needed to survive, your hand could be cut off as punishment. You could be executed for making a joke about the king, just making a joke about him. If someone overheard that and told the wrong person, you could be executed for that. And you may have heard the expression, a man's home is his castle. Have you ever heard someone say that? A man's home is his castle. And what that means is it reflects the patriarchy that was in place in medieval Europe at the time, where the man, the eldest male in the household, owned the property, owned the house, whether it was a little tiny shack or a great big castle like we see here. The male owned all of the property. The man owned any children that were produced by the marriage, and the man essentially owned his female spouse. The female spouse was his property. And when that man died, all of his property would not go to his widowed wife, but would go to his son or his sons. So the woman would just be disinherited from everything she'd grown accustomed to during her life with this man. So the expression "a man's home is his castle" reflects the patriarchal social system of England and many other cultures at that time. Rule of thumb. How many have heard you say, well, it's a rule of thumb that when we're fixing a stove, we do this? Or it's a rule of thumb when you buy a car, you should always ask. Rule of thumb. A lot of people think this came from the Bible. There's really no evidence that this is an expression from the Bible. We do have evidence of it from the English common law. And in 18th century England, the law actually stated a man could hit his wife with any reasonable instrument. So not just a stick. It could be a piece of wood. It could be a chair. It could be his fist. But he could hit his wife with any reasonable instrument. And what the rule of thumb said was a husband was allowed to beat his wife with a stick, provided the stick was no thicker than his thumb. So though it's very rare this would have occurred, if a public official had asked a man what had happened to his wife or how she'd been injured, and he said, well, I beat her with this stick, if it was a kind of smaller, thick, a little less than the width of his thumb, there's no punishment for that, even though he admits it to a government official. That's where the expression rule of thumb comes for. Now, I know when I was in elementary school and we were taught about the white settlement of this country, they didn't present it really the way I now know actually happened. Although they talked about white Europeans fighting with the Indians, they didn't really explain to us that it was an outright genocide, only done so white European settlers could acquire land and could expand toward the western part of our country. And although we did to some extent discuss slavery in America when I was in elementary school, they didn't really help us understand that the descendants of these early white settlers enslaved and tortured millions of Africans and their descendants for several hundred years. But I know now, and you know now, that the history of white settlement in this country is rife with violence. The Puritans remember we learned about the Pilgrims and the Puritans when we were in elementary school. Most Europeans, including the Puritans, were very strictly religious people, but they were also capable of incredible systematic acts of violence. So I would argue that violence is nothing new to human beings. We have proof of it going back thousands and tens of thousands of years. We know how violent cultures were in Europe. We know how violent even the white settlement was of this country. So I would respectfully disagree with any of my elders who told me that things are much more violent today than they used to be. And at the same time that we know human beings are capable of incredible acts of violence, including murder, we also know human beings are capable of incredible acts of generosity and of heroism. So just look at this one picture. This is a really bad car accident that occurred in an intersection. And you don't see any firefighters and you don't see any police officers or other first responders. All you see are bystanders, people who saw this accident occur and ran in to help. And you can see that the large minivan is on top of the small dark pickup truck. And these bystanders ran over and are using their bodies and their strength to try to hold this vehicle up off and safely away from a victim. And of course, they don't have any protective gear on. Presumably, they don't have any training in how to do this. So they're risking their own safety, their own physical safety, to try to help a perfect stranger. And we see acts of this all over the media all the time. People who run into burning buildings to save somebody in their neighborhood they don't even know. People who risk their lives and even lose their lives trying to protect someone else. So it's a very interesting dichotomy that we know humans are capable of incredible acts of selfishness and violence and abuse, and at the same time, these same human beings are capable of incredible acts of love and generosity and heroism. So, what explains this dichotomy? Well, we got lots of theories, right? In any field, we've got theories. Criminal justice, we've got lots of theories. In the fields of psychology, sociology, biology, economics, right? Every field has its theories. And in this course, we're just going to discuss some of the theories that have been put forth by professionals who've used their insight and experience to explain why they think violence occurs within families. And there's several in your book. I'm going to cover just a couple here in some detail, and you're going to read about all of them in your assigned reading this week to a much greater extent. So there's 14 theories posited in your textbook. We're going to discuss a lot of other factors that contribute and cause family violence during this semester. We're just going to start out with some theories basically from three fields at this time: psychology, sociology, and biology. And these certainly are not the only theories that exist in the world that explain family violence. They're just some. And when we discuss each one, and especially when you're taking some real time to go through the reading, and I hope you take notes from your reading, I want you to start thinking about which one of these theories makes sense to me. I want to know what makes sense to you. And I want you to think about what you already know about violence, what you already know about family violence, and I want you to look at these theories and examine them. And I want you to say to yourself, what part does this theory make sense to me? What part do I say, yes, that makes sense. That explains some of this to me. And what theories or what parts of these theories do you go, that doesn't make any sense to me at all? Because over the course of the semester, I want you to not only just memorize the topics and material that we cover, I want you to start developing your own critical analysis of these issues. And when we start doing projects and some writing during the semester, you're going to be asked for your opinion. And I not only want your opinion, I want you to be able to back it up. I want you to be able to provide support for your own views. So it's not just your opinion, but it's your opinion that's also backed up by research. So we're going to cover a few of the main ones here, and as I said, you're going to read about each one in detail in your assigned textbook reading. So the first one is psychopathology. Long word. Psycho means mind, right? You talk about getting psyched out. That means you got nervous and overwhelmed. Psycho just means mind. Pathology means disease. It can also mean abnormal. So all psychopathology means is abnormal mind or diseased mind. So the theory of psychopathologists is that mental illness and personality disorders and other psychological dysfunctions cause people to act violently toward their family members. So because they have a specific mental illness or they have a specific personality disorder, this illness or disorder is the reason why that person acts violently toward a family member. That's a theory, and it makes sense, and it explains a lot of cases of violence. However, we know that the majority of people who have mental health issues are not violent. So mental health issues may be a factor for some people who act violently. Remember, these are theories. They give us reasons, they give us research, but they don't explain every act of violence that we could ever hear of, right? But we do know that mental illness or mental health issues could play a role in some people's violent acts. Substance abuse theory. The theory here is that the abuse of drugs and or alcohol causes or contributes to family violence. And that's because the use of these substances in excess impairs judgment and lowers inhibition. So you think about an example, you go to work and your boss comes up and yells at you and makes you feel stupid in front of all your coworkers, and you think to yourself, boy, I'd like to just punch him right in the face. And then the other part of your mind says, yeah, you can't do that. The other part of your mind say, that's wrong. It's wrong to punch other people even if they're mean to you. The other part of your mind say, yeah, it would feel good to punch him in the face, but then you're going to get arrested and that's not going to feel so good. Or you think, yeah, it'd make me feel better for a minute, but then I'm going to feel really bad that I assaulted somebody and I embarrass myself. But if your boss did that and you happen to have been really drunk or under the influence of a combination of different drugs, that other part of your brain that normally helps you may be rational may go, you know what? That's exactly what he deserves. And you do punch him in the face. Because the use of intoxicating substances impairs our judgment and it lowers our inhibitions. Do you know what the most widely abused intoxicating substance in the United States is today? A lot of people say opioids because it's a lot in the news about the increased use of opioids, both street drugs like heroin and prescription opioids like oxycodone. We hear a lot about that lately. What do you think's the number one intoxicating substance abuse in the country right now? If you guessed alcohol, ding ding, you are correct. Alcohol is the most widely abused intoxicating substance, and we will be talking about alcohol and other substances throughout the semester. But even with this theory, that really seems to make sense, we know that not every substance abuser is violent. Many people suffer from alcoholism or other addictions involving street drugs or prescription drugs, and they're never violent. They've never been violent to anyone. So while substance abuse certainly plays a factor in many cases of family violence, we know it doesn't explain every single violent act. It's just a factor. Social learning theory. So the theory here is, and you see social learning, right? So this comes from sociology. If you've taken a sociology class, these terms are going to sound familiar. The theory is that people act violently towards family members because of two things that work in conjunction with each other: modeling and reinforcement. So in the picture, you see a man and a woman. They look like they're screaming at each other. They're incredibly close to each other's faces. They're pointing at each other aggressively. Their physical postures are very confrontational. And between them, you see a little kid looking up to them and observing this. So these parents are modeling this aggressive confrontational behavior to the child. They're saying, in essence, to the child, it's okay to talk to each other like this. It's okay to stick your finger in somebody else's face and scream at them. They're modeling this behavior for the child. Reinforcement is this. The next day, the child's on the playground and somebody grabs the toy he's playing with and runs away. And this child goes and finds that kid and gets in his face and starts screaming at him. And he's pointing in his face and he's physically trying to threaten the other child with his body. That's modeling, right? He's copying what he saw his parents do. Reinforcement is what happens when this kid models this behavior. Now, if nothing happens and he screams at this kid and points his finger in the face and physically leaning over and trying to intimidate him, if nobody tells him that that's wrong, if nobody says you are not allowed to act that way, if nobody gives him an appropriate punishment for that behavior and says you are not allowed to do that, then that is reinforcement, right? He got away with it. Getting away with that behavior is reinforcement. It reinforces to him that this is acceptable. So the fact his parents are modeling this behavior teaches this child it's acceptable, and him not getting punished for behaving the same way is reinforcement that this behavior is acceptable. So a lot of sociologists say that people act violently towards family members because of modeling and reinforcement. May be true. But we also know that there's plenty of people who grow up in abusive and violent homes who never act violently themselves. Many people grow up with parents who their relationships are physically and verbally violent. And yet that kid grows up and is never physically or verbally violent to anyone. So while modeling and reinforcement may certainly explain the behavior of some people, it doesn't explain the behavior of everyone. Exchange theory. This is the theory. A person commits acts of family violence because the rewards of such behavior outweigh the consequence. If a person acts violently and they get what they want and there's no negative consequence, then they're going to continue to act violently. So it's kind of like a cost-benefit analysis. If the cost to me is low and the reward is high, I'm going to do it. And sometimes you can see this with very little children, right? Have you ever heard a 2-year-old scream for a piece of candy and then somebody finally gives in and hands them a piece of candy? That's exchange theory, right? The kid knows I can scream and scream and scream, and if I do, I'm going to get a piece of candy. That's exchange theory, right? So in adults, what this theory is saying is if a person in a family can punch other people, threaten other people, verbally abuse other people, and there's no consequence for that behavior, then they're going to continue to do it. That's exchange theory. However, we know that some people do suffer very serious consequences for violent behavior, and yet they still continue to commit violent acts. We know that there's people who've lost their marriage because of their own violence. They've lost custody of their children due to their violent acts. They've been arrested. They've gone to jail. They've gone to prison. And yet they still commit violent acts. So while exchange theory is saying if there's no consequences, you'll continue to be violent, we also know some people get lots of negative consequences and yet still choose to be violent. The field of anthropology and evolutionary theory. These are not the same thing, but they fit together. So the field of anthropology tells us that all human beings evolved from apes. And although we've had thousands of years to evolve, if you look at a strand of DNA from an ape and you look at a strand of DNA from a human being, they're 98% the same. Our DNA is still incredibly similar to that of apes. In the periods of evolution, it's really not that long ago. So we're still quite similar. Now, the evolution theory of family violence is a much different thing than just the theory of evolution. The evolutional theory of violence states that parents will be aggressive or violent towards children who either cannot reproduce or towards children who are not their biological children. Now, part of this theory works for me and part of it doesn't. I've been in the field of child abuse and neglect for over 20 years, and I can't ever remember seeing a case, and I've read 100,000 cases or more, where a parent abused a child because the child could not reproduce. That one kind of doesn't make sense to me. I understand it in the animal world, where, say, a fox might kill one of its young because it knows one of its young can't reproduce due to some defect. I can see it in the animal world. Doesn't make too much sense to me when we apply it to human beings. It also says that Humans are violent towards children who are not biologically their own. And do people abuse children they're not biologically related to? Of course they do. But we also know the majority of abused children are mistreated by a biological parent. So while a foster parent or a step parent or an adoptive parent or a guardian to a child could certainly abuse a child, we also know that most children are abused by their biological parent. The one difference here I see is that sexual abuse, a very specific type of abuse, is more likely to be inflicted upon a non-biological child. This is Sadhguru, an Indian yogi, and you're going to watch a video of him this week. This video is part of your module. And in the video, he's being interviewed by Ariana Huffington, who's a journalist. And they're in front of an audience and they're talking about violence. And he is someone who's very much a proponent for peace and for nonviolent behavior. And when asked why human beings are violent, he explains his beliefs on it. And what he says is that human beings do share most of their DNA with apes, but human beings are incredibly intelligent and incredibly advanced in ways that apes are not. So he explains that human beings have great intelligence, but lack, I'm not going to tell you what he says. You're going to have to watch the video. He talks about what human beings have, all of what we have, all of our intelligence, our technology, our brilliance, our creativity, and yet we lack something very important. But I'm going to let him tell you about it in the video. Culture of violence theory. So the culture of violence theory, as explained in our textbook, says violence is an acceptable behavior in certain cultures, especially those in lower socioeconomic groups. And before you even say it, I'm going to say it. It's critical to recognize that violence occurs in all socioeconomic groups. I didn't say it was my theory. I said it was the culture of violence theory as explained in the textbook. I can tell you that in my experience working in violence within families, that some of the worst acts I've ever seen of violence within a family have occurred in the most expensive homes between people who make incredible amounts of money. So I strongly disagree that violence is more acceptable in lower socioeconomic groups. I would agree that people in lower socioeconomic groups are more often victims of violence. I would agree with that. Another thing I agree with is violence in the media must play some role, right? It just seems like it must. Our sports, our movies, our video games, TikTok, YouTube, whatever it is you're watching, there's videos or clips or segments that are incredibly violent. Our entertainment is largely incredibly violent. Watch an adventures movie, right? They're colorful and they're loud. They're also super violent. And this is where I do agree there is a generational difference. So I know that my grandparents in the morning would get their newspaper delivered to their house and they'd read all or part of the newspaper. Then they would go to work, they would come home, eat dinner, do whatever activity they did. And maybe at 10 or 11 at night, they would watch half an hour of their local news. That was the extent of their exposure to quote unquote media, a newspaper and half an hour of news. We live in an entirely different world where we walk around with supercomputers in our hands. We call them phones, but they're really supercomputers, right? And that we are exposed to violence that's occurring in sports and entertainment and in real life constantly, every minute of the day. And when we're not looking at our own phone, someone's shoving their phone in our face saying, oh my gosh, you have to look at this video. So we never get a break from it. Not only is it in our sports and in our entertainment, we're bombarded with it constantly. And I do think that we get accustomed to seeing violence. The more you see something, the more boring it gets. You may be really terrified of a spider the first time you see one, but if you had to look at one every minute of the day, you'd get used to it and it would no longer be scary. And I think there is some argument that we are impacted by all the violence we see. And on some level, to some people, it does make it more acceptable. Does it explain it for every act of violence? No, I would not agree with that. We have our theory of patriarchy. We talked about this a minute ago in reference to a man's home is his castle. The patriarchy theory states that men are just considered to be the dominant gender and they're always in the positions of control. They have economic, occupational, and physical power, and therefore dominance over women and children is inevitable. They have complete control over the money, over the property, and over the people within it. And that's going to breed violence. Have you ever heard the expression, absolute power corrupts absolutely? So whenever one person has all the power in a situation, it's almost too much to handle. And people are going to react violently to that because they can. That's the patriarchy theory. We also know not all men are violent. So it certainly doesn't explain why women are violent. And we know women are capable of incredible acts of violence and murder against family members, strangers, and their own children. So while the patriarchy theory may explain gender roles, and it certainly gives us historical perspective, it does not in any way suggest that all men are abusive or violent, and we know it doesn't explain why women can commit acts of violence. The social conflict theory. Again, social conflict comes from our field of sociology. Says that unacknowledged alienation and shame generate violence within a family. Negative feelings that are not addressed or processed create tension, and that ongoing tension builds and builds till it leads to an explosion of violence, like a ticking time bomb. We can think about this right now in relation to COVID and all the problems it's created. People are losing their jobs. People can't pay their rent. They can't pay their bills. They can't afford to go to the doctor. They don't even know if their kid's going to school or when they're going to school or how they're even going to get them there. And if a person continues to suffer adverse events like that, and they don't get help, they don't get relief, they don't get counseling, that tension is going to build and it's going to build until they explode. And that's what the social conflict theory is. And of course, we know that many people suffer adverse events and they don't explode, right? Lots of people lose their jobs or get terrible news or have more than one bad event happen to them one after the other. But it does help us understand why some people react violently. The resource theory. So the resource theory says that the person who has control over a family's resources, whether it be money, shelter, property, social prestige, is the dominant family member. And that the dominant family member may be prone to violence because they have so much control. Now, this sounds like patriarchy theory, but what's the difference? The difference is the resource theory is not related to gender. So the resource theory says it could be a man or a woman who has too much control in a family, and having all that control and power will lead to violence. So the resource theory is also used to explain why women are violent. And of course, we know that plenty of people have a lot of power and authority in their family, and that never leads them to become violent. It's a theory that it suggests an explanation for why some people become violent. Okay, that's it for your first module lecture. Now you have your textbook reading. I gave you a very specific assignment. It's pages 13 through 29, and I gave you the headings on the pages on your module page. Just a reminder that I can test you on your quizzes or midterm or final exam on material that I don't discuss or even mention in the lecture or any other part of the module. So you have reading material that I did not cover in this lecture, and you're not going to see in a video or article in the rest of the module, and yet you are still going to be responsible to know that material. You have the short video with Sadhguru talking about human intelligence and why human beings are violent. You have the VARK assessment. You may have done this before, but I'd ask you to do it again. VARK stands for Visual, Oral, Reading, Writing, and Kinetic. It's a kinetic, sorry, not Connecticut, kinetic. It's a very brief survey that just helps you discover how well you learn, whether you learn more easily visually through your ears, through reading and writing, or kinetically by actually doing something. And you'll take it. It'll take you just a couple of minutes to do. You'll get your result, and I'm asking that you send me through email your results. And when I get your results, I'll send you mine, and I'll show you what my results look like. This is important to me because during the semester, I want to make this class helpful to you. I want to teach you in the way that you learn best to the greatest extent that I can. So if you're struggling with a particular topic or piece of material, I may be able to adjust it or explain it or do something in a different way that makes it easier for you to learn. So that's the reason you're doing that assessment. It's not graded, there's no score, nothing like that. The discussion board is this week's opportunity for extra credit. You're just going to put a brief intro, tell us a little bit about something about yourself on the discussion board, and then before Monday at 11:59 p.m., you have the practice quiz. This is 5 questions. A couple of them are even kind of silly. This is not graded. This is not scored. It's simply a mechanism for you to take an assessment on Blackboard. Maybe you've never done it before. Maybe you haven't done it in a while. It's going to take you about 3 minutes to do it, and it will just give you practice taking a quiz in Blackboard, so when we do have an actual quiz, you'll be more confident about that. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I'm happy to help you in any way I can.